The wagon jolted sharply as it climbed the narrow mountain path. Anna clutched her sewing bundle to her chest, each turn of the wheels echoing deep inside her ribs. Her family had watched from the village gate as the workshop agent took her away, her mother's eyes empty, her father's shoulders slumped under silent shame. When the wagon finally stopped, she stepped down onto the rocky path. Before her stood a narrow wooden building, its roof sagging under layers of moss and dark snow-streaked tiles. A sign above the door read simply, Taylor's house. A tall, severe man in a gray wool coat watched her from the doorway. His face was sharp and pale, his eyes hidden beneath a heavy brow. He didn't speak. He only turned and stepped inside, expecting her to follow. Anna hesitated. The cold bit into her ankles, slipping up under her thin dress. She forced her legs to move forward, each step dragging her deeper into a silence that felt more final than any door ever could. As she entered, the door closed behind her with a heavy, shuddering sound. She looked around. The main room smelled of damp cloth and iron. A single lantern flickered in the corner, throwing shifting shadows across rows of sewing tables. The man turned, his voice low and without warmth. No letters, no personal belongings, no talking after dusk. Anna nodded slowly, her throat tightening. He gestured to a small side room. Her quarters, she guessed. Without waiting, he disappeared down a narrow hallway lined with finished coats and cloaks. She stood alone, her bundle pressed against her ribs. Above her head, she heard the distant creak of floorboards and a soft thud that sounded too heavy to be just footsteps. Anna lowered her head and stepped into the side room, feeling the air close around her like a tight seam she would never pick open. The door to Anna's small room barely closed before she heard the heavy steps returning down the hallway. She sat on the narrow cot, clutching her sewing bundle against her chest like a shield. The door swung open without warning. The tailor stepped inside, his tall figure blocking the light from the hallway. He looked around her small space, at the plain cot, the chipped basin, the bare floor, as if inspecting a new tool, not a human being. "Give it," he said, his hand outstretched. Anna hesitated, tightening her grip on the bundle. His fingers twitched, and for a moment his face darkened, an unspoken threat pulsing beneath the surface. Slowly she handed over the cloth. He turned it over roughly, checking for hidden letters or trinkets. When he found nothing, he tossed it back onto the cot with a dismissive flick. "No letters home, no personal cloth, nothing that ties you back," he said, each word landing heavy and final. Anna swallowed hard, her voice curled inside her chest, too afraid to rise. "Work begins at first light," he continued. "No talking after dusk. You finish all tasks before you sleep. If you fail—" His pale eyes drifted to the corner of the room where a single iron hook jutted from the wall. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Anna followed his gaze, her skin crawling at the implication. He stepped back, his boots loud against the wooden floor. At the doorway he paused, turning his head slightly as though remembering something small and unimportant. "You're not special here," he murmured. "Don't think of escape. Don't think of home." Then he disappeared into the hallway, the echo of his steps lingering long after the door creaked shut. Anna let her head fall forward, her fingers twisting the edge of her skirt. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had pressed closer with every word he spoke. She looked down at her empty hands, realizing in that moment how much she had already lost, and how much more could still be taken. The morning bell rang before the sun rose over the dark line of pines. Anna jolted awake, her body still curled tight from the night's cold. She pulled on her thin shawl and stepped into the hallway, her breath already trembling. In the main workshop, 2 other young women were already at their stations. One had pale hair tucked under a faded kerchief. The other's dark hair hung loose down her back. Their faces were gray and hollow, as if every word had been pulled out of them long ago. Anna stepped closer, her eyes searching for any sign of warmth, of recognition, anything human. But when the pale-haired girl glanced up, her eyes darted away so quickly that Anna felt as if she had been struck. The workshop smelled sharply of wool, candle wax, and iron. Long wooden tables stood in rows, each covered with heavy coats in various states of repair. Scissors, thread spools, and broken needles littered every surface, like a battlefield frozen in place. The tailor appeared at the far end of the room, moving silently between tables, inspecting stitches and snipping stray threads with quick, precise motions. Every time he passed, the girls' shoulders tensed, their heads bending lower over their work. Anna was given a seat at a small table near a narrow barred window. A pile of half-finished gloves and scarves sat waiting. Her fingers hesitated on the first piece of cloth, the needle trembling so violently she almost dropped it. She risked another glance at the two girls. The pale-haired one stitched without looking up, her fingers moving in a trance. The dark-haired girl's hands trembled slightly, her stitches uneven. Anna's throat burned with the urge to speak, to ask them where they were from, how long they had been here. But the room's silence pressed against her chest like a hand. The tailor stopped behind her. She felt the cold presence before she saw his shadow stretch across her table. "No mistakes," he said softly, too close to her ear. His breath smelled of stale tea and old fabric. Anna swallowed and bent over her work. With each tiny stitch, her thoughts beat against her skull. Don't cry, don't speak, just keep moving. Outside the window, the sky turned from black to ash gray, but inside no light broke through. Days folded into each other like seams no one would ever unpick. Anna worked in a dull trance, her fingers moving from fabric to fabric, needle to thread, barely aware of the slow passage of time. But even in that heavy silence, she began to notice things. Along the base of one table leg, she found deep scratches, like someone had dragged a sharp tool again and again in quiet desperation. In a drawer under her sewing bench, she discovered a false bottom, a small, hidden compartment lined with dust and a scrap of yellowed linen. There was nothing else inside, but the space itself felt like a whisper from someone long gone. One evening, as she carried a stack of folded cloaks to a side shelf, Anna saw the pale-haired girl slip something small into her apron pocket. Their eyes met for a brief, electric moment. The girl's lips parted, but no words came. She turned away so quickly that Anna almost doubted she had seen anything at all. In the hallway near her small room, Anna noticed strange stains on the floorboards, dark, uneven smudges that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Once she knelt and pressed her fingers to the marks. They felt dry and rough under her skin, but she snatched her hand away as the tailor's footsteps echoed nearby. At night, she heard muted sobs from the other side of the thin walls, cut short by sudden, harsh silence. Sometimes, footsteps creaked past her door and paused, as if listening for signs of life inside. She would hold her breath until the air in her lungs turned to fire. The walls seemed to close in tighter each night. She dreamt of her mother's face, but woke each morning unable to recall it clearly, as if even her memories were being stitched shut inside her. Anna began to move differently, her eyes flicking over every corner, every shadow. She wasn't just sewing anymore. She was learning the shape of her prison, thread by hidden thread. Late one night, after the others had vanished into their rooms, Anna sat hunched at her table, her eyes heavy but her fingers still restless. From inside her apron, she pulled out a small embroidered cloth, the only thing she had managed to keep from home, hidden under her dress since the day she arrived. The tiny flowers on it were clumsy, stitched by her younger sister's hand years ago. She ran her thumb over the faded threads, feeling warmth rise in her chest, a fragile echo of a world she thought she had forgotten. But before she could slip it back into her apron, a sudden chill crawled over her neck. She turned and saw the tailor standing in the doorway, his shadow spilling across the workshop floor. His eyes dropped to her hands. Slowly he stepped forward, each footstep a deliberate, sharp accusation. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice low but cutting like a blade. Anna's fingers curled around the cloth, but he was already upon her. He tore it from her grasp, holding it up to the lantern light, his pale face twisted with disgust. "Sentiment!" he spat. "Weakness!" Before she could react, he flung the cloth into the small fire burning in the iron stove at the corner of the room. The flames seized it instantly, swallowing the flowers in a sudden hungry flare. Anna lunged forward, a hoarse cry tearing from her throat, but he grabbed her by the shoulders and shoved her backward. She crashed into the table, the edge biting into her spine. He leaned close, his fingers digging into her arms until her skin burned. "There will be no reminders here," he whispered, his breath sour and hot. You belong to this place now." He threw her aside, and she fell hard against the floorboards, the air punched from her lungs. By the time she lifted her head, he was gone, the door swinging shut with a final echoing thud. Anna crawled to the stove, reaching for the ashes with shaking hands. But there was nothing left, only black dust and the faint, acrid scent of home turned to smoke. She knelt there for a long time, her forehead pressed to the cold iron. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The last soft thread snapped, leaving only the sharp, cold edge of survival. The next morning, Anna's arms ached with bruises where his fingers had gripped her. Her head spun with exhaustion and grief, but the day began as if nothing had happened. She stumbled into the workshop, her steps uneven, her eyes blurry with tears she no longer dared to let fall. The other two girls didn't look at her. Their heads bowed deeper than before, their needles moving in frantic, trembling rhythms. When the tailor appeared, his face was pale and blank, as though the night's violence had been a passing breeze. He pointed at Anna without a word, then gestured sharply toward the attic stairs at the far end of the hallway. Anna froze. A tremor ran through her knees. He stepped forward, his hand closing around her elbow. This time he didn't yank. He guided her with quiet, icy force, the kind that made her skin crawl more than any shout. At the base of the attic stairs, he shoved her forward. She looked up at the narrow, splintered steps spiraling into darkness. "Ask no questions," he said softly, almost kindly, a terrible mockery. "Think of no one." Then he pushed her again. Anna caught herself on the railing, splinters driving into her palms. Slowly she climbed, each creak of the wood echoing like a clock ticking away her last remaining courage. At the top, she stepped into a small attic room that smelled of dust and old wool. The walls slanted inward, the ceiling so low she had to crouch. A single broken chair sat in the corner beside a cracked window that let in only a thin slice of gray morning light. She turned back, but the door slammed shut before she could speak. The lock snapped into place with a cold finality that curled through her chest. Anna slid down against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest. The air was thin and dry, scraping her throat with every shallow breath. She pressed her forehead to her knees, fighting the rising panic that clawed at her ribs. Outside, the workshop continued. The scrape of chairs, the hiss of thread pulling through thick cloth. Life went on, indifferent to her silent confinement above. In the attic's dark hush, Anna felt the shape of her own fear in her bones. It stretched out beside her, close as a shadow, whispering that this place was not just a prison of wood and iron, but a cage designed to erase her piece by piece. The attic swallowed hours as if they were drops of water falling into a dry well. Anna sat curled in the corner, her fingers raw from scratching at her sleeves, her lips cracked from thirst and the thin, stale air. When the first dim glow of moonlight slipped through the cracked window, she forced herself to stand. Her knees buckled, but she caught the edge of the broken chair to steady herself. She scanned the narrow room, her eyes darting over old trunks, folded scraps of fabric, and piles of dusty, moth-eaten wool. In one corner, half hidden behind a collapsed bundle of cloth, she spotted a small wooden box with a warped lid. Heart pounding, she pulled it toward her and pried it open. Inside lay a thin, leather-bound journal, the pages yellowed and brittle at the edges. The first page trembled under her fingers as she opened it. The writing inside was uneven and hurried. Names, dates, snippets of terrified thoughts. "He watches at night. I tried to run. There's a space under the floor." Anna's eyes darted across each line, the words slicing through her fogged mind. She flipped further, finding entries that spoke of attempts to escape, whispers of a tunnel hidden beneath the workshop floor. She never came back. The last entry stopped her breath entirely. "If you find this, don't wait. He breaks us in silence." Anna pressed the journal to her chest, feeling her pulse echo in the brittle paper. She looked toward the door, the lock glinting faintly in the moonlight, and a thin, fierce spark ignited inside her. Her fear shifted then. It became something sharper, a blade rather than a weight. She knew she wouldn't survive if she stayed. The journal wasn't just a record. It was a map, a ghost's desperate call that now thrummed through her own bones. Anna clenched the journal tight. In the cold, dusty attic, surrounded by the last breaths of those who had come before her, she made a silent promise. She would not be the next scribbled name in someone else's hidden book. When the attic door finally creaked open at dawn, Anna barely flinched. Her body felt hollow, her mind razor-sharp after the long, frozen night. The tailor stood at the top of the stairs, his shadow spilling across the cramped floor. He didn't bother to look at her as he gestured sharply, signaling her to come down. Anna stepped forward, tucking the journal into the folds of her skirt. Each step down the narrow staircase felt like walking on a blade's edge. In the workshop, the two other girls sat slumped over their tables, dark circles carved beneath their eyes. The pale-haired girl's needle hung motionless in her fingers. The dark-haired girl's stitches zigzagged wildly across the cloth. The tailor snapped his fingers, the sharp sound slicing through the fog of exhaustion. "Work," he ordered, his voice low and clipped. Anna was shoved to her usual seat. A pile of heavy coats and gloves waited for her, and he dropped a small basket of tangled thread beside them. "You don't sleep," he said, each word tapping at her skull like a hammer. "You work until I say. No food, no water." Anna's fingers fumbled over the cloth, her arms trembling with weakness. The needle pricked her skin again and again, thin red beads staining the rough fabric. Her vision blurred. The room seemed to pulse around her, each breath catching in her throat like a stone. Hours blurred into one endless, suffocating loop. Every so often the tailor passed behind her, his pale eyes grazing over her work with the sharpness of a blade. The journal's words thrummed in her mind. "There's a space under the floor." She forced her hands to keep moving, her fingers a thin disguise for her thoughts. In her head she mapped every board, every knot in the wood. She memorized each creak when she shifted her feet, each dark line where dust gathered thicker. Her exhaustion shifted into something else, a cold, trembling focus. Each stitch she pulled was a silent count toward the moment she would act. When night finally crawled in through the high windows, Anna's eyes were empty, but behind them a plan glowed like a hidden ember, waiting for the first breath of air to set it burning. When the workshop finally fell silent, Anna's hands dropped into her lap, her fingers aching and raw. The other two girls had already retreated to their corners, their movements slow and lifeless, their eyes glazed with quiet defeat. The tailor snuffed out the lanterns one by one, each flame vanishing with a hiss. Before stepping into his own quarters, he cast one last look across the room. His gaze lingered on Anna, but she kept her head bowed, her breath steady despite the tremors rippling under her skin. The door clicked shut. The lock slid into place with a dull scrape, a sound she had come to know too well. For a moment, the darkness pressed against her like a heavy blanket. She forced her breathing to slow, waiting until even the smallest sounds, the ticking of the old wall clock, the creak of the distant rafters, felt like thunder in the silence. Then she moved. Anna slid to her knees beside her work table, her fingers searching along the floorboards. She traced the knots and cracks she had memorized, each brush of her fingertips sending sparks of pain up her arms. Finally she found it, a narrow seam, nearly invisible in the dim light leaking from the moon through the high windows. She pressed her nails into it, pulling until the board shifted with a reluctant groan. Beneath it yawned a narrow tunnel, its mouth dark and musty. She leaned closer. The air below smelled of earth and old secrets. Her hands trembled as she pulled the board aside completely. She lowered the journal in first, then the small bread knife she had hidden in her apron. Her only defense. A sudden noise behind her made her freeze. She turned sharply, her heart smashing against her ribs. But it was only the dark-haired girl, standing at her table, her eyes wide and glittering in the half-light. For a second they stared at each other, two ghosts caught between fear and the raw edge of hope. Then, slowly, the girl reached into her pocket and pulled out a scrap of yellowed paper. She stepped forward and pressed it into Anna's palm, her touch feather-light. Anna unfolded it with shaking fingers. A rough hand-drawn map, the tunnel's path, the hidden exit. Their eyes met again, and for the first time Anna saw something alive flicker there, a silent wish for freedom neither dared to say out loud. Anna nodded, her throat too tight for words. She tucked the map close to her chest, turned back to the open tunnel, and lowered herself inside. The earth closed around her like a second skin, cool and damp. As she began to crawl forward, she felt the first fragile shape of escape pulse through her veins like a heartbeat. The tunnel swallowed Anna completely, its walls pressing close against her shoulders and hips. The air was damp and sharp with the scent of earth and old rot. Each movement forward scraped her knees and elbows raw, but she didn't stop. In the cramped dark, her thoughts surged and collided. She pictured the tailor pacing above, imagined his pale eyes scanning the workshop, his hands searching for her in cold fury. The map crackled softly against her chest with each breath. She forced herself to remember every line she had traced on it. The turns, the shallow dips, the final exit marked with a single trembling X. Suddenly, a muffled thud echoed above her. Then another. Anna froze, pressing her forehead to the cool dirt. The sound grew louder, doors slamming, furniture scraping. She knew then he had discovered her absence. Panic clawed at her ribs, but she clenched her teeth and crawled faster. Her fingers tore at roots and clumps of earth, her breaths ragged and loud in the tight space. She reached a fork in the tunnel and turned sharply left, just as the map had shown. The space narrowed even more, and for a moment she thought she might be wedged forever, swallowed by the earth like so many secrets before her. A sudden flash of memory. The journal's last line. He breaks us in silence. She forced herself onward, pulling with every scrap of strength left. The tunnel began to rise, the slope so steep she had to dig her toes and claw upward with both hands. Behind her, a faint echo reached her ears, a sound like boots striking floorboards, distant but chasing her heartbeat. She slipped, her nails tearing against the damp walls, but she caught herself pushing harder. A sudden breeze, cool and thin, brushed her cheek. She raised her head and saw a faint slice of gray light ahead. The exit. Anna's chest seized with a jolt of fierce, desperate hope. She lunged forward, every muscle burning, her body trembling with exhaustion and terror. As she neared the opening, she felt the tunnel shudder behind her, as if the earth itself might collapse and trap her forever. She shoved her shoulders through the narrow gap, gasping as her face met the cold morning air beyond. With a final, desperate pull, Anna hauled herself into the thin light of dawn. A thin, broken gasp escaping her lips as she spilled out onto wet moss and open sky. Anna lay sprawled on the moss, her chest heaving in sharp, painful bursts. The early morning air bit at her sweat-soaked skin, each breath tasting of pine and cold dew instead of dust and candle smoke. She rolled onto her side, her fingers sinking into the wet earth. Above her, thin strips of gray sky peeked through branches heavy with fog. For the first time in what felt like centuries, she saw no walls, no barred windows, only the soft, endless hush of the forest waking around her. She forced herself upright, her limbs shaking so violently she nearly collapsed again. The journal slipped from her apron and landed in the moss. She snatched it up, holding it close against her heart as though it might anchor her to the ground. Behind her, the tunnel's narrow mouth gaped, silent and black. For a moment, she imagined a pale hand clawing its way out after her, long fingers dragging across the forest floor. She stumbled backward, her eyes fixed on that hole, waiting for movement that never came. The memory of the tailor's face rose before her. Those empty eyes, the cruel twist of his mouth. Even now, she felt his breath on her neck, heard the echo of his footsteps pounding closer in the dark. Anna turned, nearly falling as she forced her legs into motion. She stumbled forward into the trees, her hair catching on low branches, her palms scraping against rough bark. Birdsong drifted faintly from somewhere deeper in the woods, so strange and fragile that it almost shattered her. She pressed on, the map crumpled in her fist, the journal thudding against her chest with every uneven step. As she moved, she realized she had no clear direction, only the instinct to put as much distance as possible between her and that hidden workshop. A single thought pulsed beneath her skin. Don't stop, don't look back. Anna stumbled onward, deeper into the fog-draped forest. Each step was a quiet rebellion, a small, painful proof that she was still her own. Bruised, broken, but not yet gone. Anna pressed deeper into the forest, the dawn light slowly turning from a pale gray to a soft, uncertain gold. Every step felt as if she were tearing herself out of the tailor's grasp all over again. Her legs shook beneath her, each movement raw and sharp against her battered muscles. Roots snatched at her ankles, wet ferns slapped her cheeks, but she didn't slow. The map in her fist had become a damp, crumpled scrap, the ink smudged beyond use, but she clung to it anyway, as though its presence alone might guide her. Eventually, she found a narrow stream trickling between mossy rocks. She collapsed beside it, dipping her raw hands into the icy water. The sting jolted her fully awake, and she gulped it down, the cold flooding her throat like needles. As she drank, her reflection trembled on the water's surface. Sunken cheeks, wild hair stuck to her face, and eyes so wide and hollow they looked like they belonged to someone else. She looked away quickly, scrubbing her face with both hands, as if she could wash off the months of silent commands and invisible chains. Clutching the journal to her chest, she crawled to a nearby tree and sat with her back pressed to its trunk. She flipped through the brittle pages again, rereading the frantic lines. Each entry felt like a ghost's whisper, a trail of grief that led her here but could not tell her what came next. She realized then the journal had been a map out, not a map forward. A sudden rustle behind her sent her heart pounding against her ribs. She twisted around, clutching the bread knife she had hidden in her apron. But it was only a deer, its delicate head lifted in surprise before it bounded away, vanishing into the mist. Anna's breath faltered. The knife slipped from her grip, dropping into the moss with a dull thud. For the first time since the tunnel, she let herself weep. The sobs clawed out of her chest, raw and aching, echoing into the waking forest. When the tears finally slowed, she wiped her cheeks and pulled her knees up tight. The forest around her felt endless and watchful, a place that did not care whether she survived. But as she listened to the stream's steady trickle, she felt a tiny thread of warmth twist inside her chest. She had escaped. Wherever she went next, it would be on her own breath, her own pulse. For the first time in too long, she belonged only to herself, and that fragile truth burned brighter than any lantern she had ever known. When the sun finally broke through the thick canopy, it painted the forest floor in thin, trembling rays of gold. Anna blinked against the sudden light, her body aching from the cold and from the unyielding bark that had pressed into her back all night. She stood slowly, each movement pulling at the bruises and cuts that lined her arms and legs. The journal rested against her chest, tied now with a torn strip from her apron. The bread knife lay at her feet. She picked it up and tucked it into the waistband of her dress. She looked around. The forest was eerily still, the quiet so deep it pressed against her ears. But beneath that hush, Anna felt something new, the subtle electric edge of freedom humming at her skin. She began to walk, her steps cautious at first, testing each patch of moss and stone. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the sigh of a breeze, sent sharp flares of fear up her spine. Yet she kept moving, threading her way between gnarled trunks and thickets of thorn. Then ahead she saw it, a narrow animal trail snaking deeper into the trees and curving out of sight. She paused, her breath caught. This was her path now, unknown, unmarked by any map or ghost's journal. She stepped forward, and suddenly a loud crack split the air behind her. Anna spun, her heart clawing at her ribs. A branch shuddered where something, or someone, had moved. Through the tangle of shadows she saw a glimpse, a pale flash, the unmistakable outline of a man's coat. Her blood turned to ice. Without thinking, she turned and ran. The forest rushed past in a blur of green and gray, her hair whipping against her cheeks, breath tearing out in ragged gasps. She heard snapping branches behind her, quick and angry. Each step felt like running through wet cement, her limbs sluggish from days of exhaustion and fear. She nearly tripped over a root but caught herself pushing forward. In her mind, a single chant roared, "Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop." When she burst out into a clearing, her legs gave out and she collapsed onto her knees. She turned, knife drawn, her chest heaving, eyes wild. But the forest behind her remained still. No figure emerged. Only the whisper of leaves in the wind and the distant cry of a bird answered her panic. She lowered the knife slowly, her shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. She wasn't safe yet, but she was alive, and she had chosen this moment, this place, this breath. Anna sank to the moss, her pulse still galloping, and let her forehead rest on her hands. For now, she had outrun him. And for the first time the thought came with a sharp, wild spark of defiance instead of pure terror. Anna stayed on her knees for a long moment, listening, her breath rasping in the cold morning air. When she finally rose, her whole body shook, her limbs buzzing with leftover fear and exhaustion. She looked around the clearing. Pale flowers dotted the moss, trembling in the breeze. Thin beams of sunlight dripped through the trees like timid fingers. It felt impossibly distant from the tailor's workshop. A world that didn't belong to the same universe as thread, needles, and orders whispered in the dark. Anna forced her legs to move again, stumbling at first, then finding a rough rhythm. She crossed the clearing and entered another thick stretch of woods, weaving past slick stones and twisted roots. Each step felt heavier, but she pushed forward, gripping the knife so tightly her knuckles turned white. As she climbed a shallow slope, her foot slipped on wet leaves. She tumbled sideways, crashing against a tree trunk. The journal fell from her apron, landing open on the ground. She scrambled to grab it, her fingers brushing the yellowed pages. Her eyes caught the last written words again. "He breaks us in silence." A tremor moved through her. A wave of grief for the girls who hadn't made it, whose silent struggles lined the walls and floorboards of that prison. She pressed the journal to her heart, feeling the echo of all their unfinished stories. Anna stood, breathless and shaking, and turned her face to the sky. The forest around her seemed to exhale, the mist lifting just enough to reveal a thin line of light on the distant ridge. She moved toward it, stumbling but determined. Her wounds throbbed. Every muscle in her body ached with cold and fatigue, but she kept going. At the ridge's edge, she paused. Beyond it, the world opened into a wide valley, soft and green under the waking sun. A small, winding river shimmered like a ribbon far below. Anna fell to her knees again, not from weakness this time, but from the crushing weight of freedom. Her fingers dug into the dirt, anchoring her as tears slipped down her cheeks. She raised her face to the sun. The light felt almost too bright, too alive, burning into every raw place inside her. Anna closed her eyes and let it wash over her. In that moment, there was no tailor, no attic, no whispered rules. Only her own breath, her own heartbeat, and a future she would stitch together, one trembling step at a time. Anna remained at the ridge's edge, her breath moving in quiet waves, each inhale deeper than the last. The valley below seemed to shimmer and shift in the early light, as though inviting her into a new, unwritten world. She pressed the journal to her chest one last time before tucking it carefully into her apron. It felt heavier now, not just a record of others' suffering, but a living thread connecting her to every girl who had fought before her. With slow, unsteady hands, she wiped her tear-streaked face. The knife rested at her side, its blade dull and stained, a final relic of the fight that had carried her this far. She laid it gently on the ground, her fingers hovering over it for a moment. Then she let it go. Anna stood, swaying slightly, the wind catching at her hair and tugging at the frayed edges of her dress. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, the ground beneath her feet no longer a prison floor, but soft, living earth. As she descended into the valley, each footfall felt like a small victory, a whispered promise to herself that she would never again belong to anyone else. She moved slowly, her arms wrapped around her ribs as if holding herself together. The path ahead was uncertain and wild, marked by thick grass and scattered rocks. Somewhere beyond the first bend, smoke rose faintly, perhaps a farm or a distant village, but she didn't rush. She paused to look back one final time. The forest stood silent behind her, the ridge now a thin line against the brightening sky. A shiver ran through her, but she did not turn around fully. Anna faced forward again, the first warmth of morning spilling across her cheeks. Her lips parted, and though no sound came out, her chest lifted as if she had finally drawn her first free breath. Step by step, she moved farther from the darkness that had almost devoured her. She had no map now, no guide, no master, only the sharp, fragile pulse of her own will carrying her forward. By the time the sun cleared the treetops completely, Anna had disappeared into the valley, leaving behind the echo of a girl who had refused to vanish into silence. She was her own now, a thread no longer bound, a story finally hers to finish.